Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here. Unlike probably everyone else in the room, and unlike 28% of millennials, I'm not a coffee expert. I'm an economist, I'm a bean counter, but it's been my great privilege to sometimes be a coffee bean counter. And so some of what I'll talk about to you today is informed by my work with coffee as well as with other food products. As we've already talked a lot about, consumers care more than about just a great cup of coffee. They increasingly care about how that cup of coffee is made. And that's generally more and more true of all foods and beverages. So whether or not coffee is organic, whether or not that coffee is being grown in ways that are protecting rainforests and bird habitat, who grows that coffee and how well they're paid. These are things we care about, and for some consumers, these issues are as much a component of the coffee as the flavor, the aroma, the price, or the convenience of where they buy it. So I want to talk today about the consumer decision-making side of this and not about how we provide these attributes or how many more fair trade producers are certified this year than 5 years ago, or where to go for more information. I think most of you are very familiar with that, and that information is readily available. Instead, I want to talk to you about ethical concerns as consumable attributes of coffee. So to a food chemist, a cup of coffee is a complex bundle of compounds. To a sensory scientist, that cup of coffee is a bundle of aromas, flavors, and mouthfeels. To an economist, that cup of coffee is a bundle of attributes. And consumers weigh those different attributes in different regards according to their preference, and each person might weigh those differently. So in order to understand the decisions that people make when it comes to purchasing a cup of brewed coffee or a bag of beans on the supermarket shelf, it's helpful to maybe think about a typology of attributes. So the first type of attribute I want to talk to you about are search attributes. The big one on this is price, right? I look for a price tag, I look for the label on the shelf, I want to know how much something costs. And once I have that information, I pretty much know what to do with it. If you buy a house, you can look on a map and see how close is that to work. What's the quality of the schools? Is there a park nearby where my kids can play? So you put a lot of effort into search attributes in that case, right? So the way you might advertise the presence of search attributes is just provide information. Here's the price. Here's the nutritional content. Here are things you want to know that I can provide you, often in fairly objective ways. Right? So that's how we advertise or communicate search attributes of our products. The second category of attributes are experiential attributes. These are largely but not completely subjective, and these are things that people form their own opinion of when they experience a good. When you purchase a product, when you consume a cup of coffee, oh, I like the taste of that. I don't like the taste of that. An hour later, how do you feel? Is your stomach feeling okay? The ambiance of your favorite coffee house. These are experiential attributes. And once somebody is formulating an experience, that might change over time, but it's kind of hard to tell somebody that their experience was wrong, right? So these are things that are a bit more intrinsic to the consumer. Think about how we try to communicate or advertise experiential attributes. It's very difficult. So this is the type of advertising where you might see associative advertising when you want to communicate these attributes. To move away from coffee and food and beverage, think about cologne. It's hard to advertise cologne. So when we see a billboard for cologne, we might see a billboard with semi-nude people, right? And we're trying to associate this with sensuality. And for some reason in cologne advertising, it never seems to be a whole body. It's always some part of a body, right? Half a shoulder or something. Or we might go for testimonials, right? The celebrity endorsement. So somehow information's from somebody you might trust or that you might associate yourself with, and they'll tell you about their experience, and you think, well, maybe that'll be my experience as well. So that's the type of advertising we might see around experiential attributes. And then the third category of attributes are credence attributes. And if there's only one thing you remember about anything I say today, I would like you to remember credence attributes. Credence attributes are attributes that even after you experience a product for yourself, you really don't know if they're there. But we still might care very much to different degrees about the presence or absence of credence attributes. Was that apple really organic? I don't taste the pesticide residue on it, right? So to the average consumer, this information the trust that it's there isn't readily accessible. Okay? I can't taste the satisfaction or suffering of a coffee bean grower on the basis of my experience of the cup, but for some consumers, these are very as important as well. So from this viewpoint, the ethical concerns of the consumers are really attributes of the coffee. They're credence attributes of the coffee. Fair trade or not, organic or conventional, whether or not the beans were shade grown in a way that protected bird habitat or prevented deforestation. These are mixed in the cup along with the aromas and the flavor and the price and the milk and the sugar and whatever else might be in that cup of coffee. So for some consumers, they might put these credence attributes very high. They might treat them as really deal breakers. For others, it might just be something they balance off. I'd pay an extra 5 cents for a brewed cup of fair trade coffee, but not an extra $1. Right? And for some people, they really might be ignored. Okay? So, we can talk about market segments, but we can also talk about motivations and food lifestyles. And for some people, these are very much a part of food lifestyle. And I'll mention in a little while why I think that this is increasingly so and will continue to be increasingly so. So the challenge of communicating credence attributes is exactly what I mentioned a minute ago. The consumer can't really trust that those attributes are there in the cup of coffee even after they consume it. And because they're generally relatable to process attributes of production that aren't observable. And because provision of these attributes is generally associated with a higher cost of production, right? We don't use pesticides because we think it's fun to use pesticides. We use pesticides because they protect yields. And so to not use pesticides might often involve higher costs of production. So because of that, and because people have a willingness to pay for some of these attributes, there's the opportunity for fraud by unscrupulous retailers and marketers. And consumers are aware of this. So they want the credence attributes, but they don't necessarily trust all claims that these are present there. Because of this incentive for some people to perhaps overstate or lie about the presence of these attributes. So this is a problem, and we call that problem information asymmetry. That different parties to this transaction of selling a cup of coffee have different bits of information. The consumer knows what she wants, but the producer, and here to the consumer, everything in that supply chain before that decision is the producer, okay, doesn't necessarily know where those are. And of course, to provide some of these credence attributes, we know that that can be very difficult to ensure these processes along the supply chain. So how do we overcome information asymmetry? Well, the main tool we've seen is the provision of third-party certification that's signaled with a label in the marketplace. If I don't know if I can trust the producer or the retailer of a cup of coffee or a bag of beans, I can look for a familiar label. Now, obviously, there's still some work on the part of the consumer to understand what these labels might mean and to look for them, but it is a simpler process than it would otherwise be if these labels are present. So we've seen more and more use of these labels. Some of these are very much common on coffee, like Fair Trade, Rainforest Alliance Certified. Some of these things, and many of these are voluntary, process-based standards, such as Fair Trade. A much older one, kosher certification, right? That's a process-based standard with third-party verification, competing certifiers, much like in the fair trade space. And that's been around for many decades, earlier than the fair trade labels, which is the earliest of the ethical consumption labels that we've seen in coffee. It's been around since the late 80s now. Some of these are mandatory labels, like the Nutrition Facts Panel here in the United States. Some of these might be voluntary and more about nutritional attributes, so to take nutrition facts information and try to simplify that for the consumer's benefit, things like Nuval, Guiding Stars, or something like the Smart Choices program. So there's a lot of labels. In fact, this slide that I'm showing you in the background is a mess, and I did that on purpose. Because when you see all these labels, you've got to start to wonder and worry, are there too many labels? Is there perhaps the opportunity for label confusion? Are we perhaps drowning in information? This is already 3 years old, and you can see right there 90 labels specifically in the food space in the United States alone, several hundred internationally. And that's in the that's in the context of hundreds and hundreds of consumer-facing labels in the United States and over 1,000 worldwide. This slide's 3 years old. My best guess is that this has probably doubled in the US in those 3 years alone, because we've seen store-specific labels being introduced. We see multiple labels popping up for products like seafood. So all this information is going on. So there's a competition for consumers' attention around these labels as well. And it's very hard to keep track of what any one label might mean and what the processes that are behind there. So some have characterized the rise of these labels as tools in what you might call political consumerism. The idea that instead of voting through political processes and trying to wield influence for outcomes that some people might want to see in society, outcomes on the environment, outcomes on how people are paid, outcomes on the nutritional content of food, that instead we can vote with our dollars. So this idea of political consumerism, shopping with your shopping cart, it might be one motivation that, for consumers, that they want to see something different in the world, and this is a way of enacting change. So in this attribute-based approach of viewing consumer decisions, we can think that it's not the products themselves that satisfy the needs of the consumer, but it's the attributes that satisfy them. And most people are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that basic needs like physiological needs, the need for breathing, food, water, sex for reproduction of the species, these needs need to be met first before we can meet other needs like safety or the need for love and belonging. Well, these credence attributes of food and beverages often fit in towards the top of the pyramid. That these have to do with self-esteem or the esteem of others, or around self-actualization. That somehow I can define the type of person I am by choosing some of these products that have the presence of these credence attributes. And this translates to the idea of a food-related lifestyle, that there are lifestyles, people have motivations to attain these higher level order needs, and they develop food lifestyles that may or may not incorporate attainment of these higher needs as well as the more basic needs. And for many, those of you who are interested in the marketing of products, that often the key for marketing a specialty product in any area is understanding the food-related lifestyles that most tap into your products. And so getting back to labels, the motivations, those exist on the part of the consumers. Right? They might be informed by external forces. I think they're heavily informed by external forces that are constantly evolving, but those motivations are on the part of consumers. The labels then provide the opportunity to purchase products that have these attributes. All right, so this is getting a little theoretical. Let me step back a bit and talk about some empirical results that I've done with coffee in some experiments that I think might be of interest to you. So I'm really happy that Rick earlier mentioned this idea that coffee, or that wine might taste better if you know you paid more for it, or if you see the Wine Spectator label and there's a nice high number up in the 90s there. So in some experiments we did with coffee, we found the same is true with interaction with these credence attributes. That if you think your coffee is doing good, then you might also think it's a better cup of coffee, and that you might have a better experience. So this study just involved consumer intercepts. It's very simple overall liking taste tests on a 9-point scale with untrained consumers. And we just asked people, how do you like this coffee? Prepare it however you like. And in the first round, they weren't told what the identity of the coffees were, but these were conventional and fair trade coffees that were paired from the same suppliers, similar roasts, and we worked with several different pairings, and randomized that across participants in our study. And basic finding here was that on average, there was no difference in the liking between the conventional and the fair trade products that we offered. They were pretty much the same, no significant difference across several hundred participants. Then we provided a very little bit of information about the fair trade label so that participants who weren't familiar with the label would at least have some information. Many participants were familiar with the label. And then we revealed the identity of the products and had a second round of tasting and said, here's a fair trade cup of coffee, here's a conventional cup of coffee. They were the exact same cups of coffee that they had tasted a few minutes before. We didn't tell them that, but many of them might have guessed it. Result number 2, the conventional coffee, no difference after you've told them that that was a conventional cup of coffee than before. Result number 3, on average, far more liking of the fair trade coffee than before when they didn't know that it was fair trade. So telling them this is fair trade coffee, then they had a higher overall liking of it. The same consumers 5 minutes later. So not a vast difference in their life experiences between the two tastings. So some consumers are heavily motivated by the presence or absence of these credence attributes, but they interact with these other attributes as well. So it might not be as simple as just trading off, oh, I'll accept a cup of coffee that doesn't taste as good to me if I know that it's somehow really good on other things I care about. But actually that might enhance that overall experience. The same way that I might enjoy my cup of coffee a lot more in a coffee shop with nice ambiance or with good friends. All right, another set of studies that I want to talk about. The main takeaway from here is that fair trade coffee, other credence-labeled coffees are not just another brand to the consumers that care most about it. Fair trade coffee, again, is what I'm talking about here because it's the most commonly recognized credence attribute with a third-party certification label behind it. What we did in this study is we had the great opportunity to work with a independent specialty coffee house and play around with their prices. Now, any of you who operate coffee houses, I'm sure you would not let me come in and raise your prices and risk annoying your customers. So everything we did was with discounts. But they very graciously allowed us to give discounts on different products on different days. And so this is a field experiment. The people who were participating in the study didn't know they were involved in an experiment. They just knew that there was a discount being offered one day on a fair trade variety of coffee, another day on different conventionals. And we did that several days over a period of many weeks. And we looked at the differences in sales, and then we stopped people afterward and asked them just a few questions about what they had bought and a few questions about them. And there were a lot of interesting results that we got out of the study, but the main takeaway here is that when we look at the price response to fair trade coffee, we found it was different than the price response on the conventional coffee. If we discounted the price of the fair trade coffee, we could get more people to switch from buying a conventional cup that day, and these were all brewed cups, to buying a cup of the fair trade. But when we discounted the conventional coffee, people didn't stop buying the fair trade coffee very much. And we also found a lower own price elasticity for the fair trade coffee, that the fair trade coffee drinkers were more likely to stick with that product regardless of what was going on with the price of it. So relatively little difference in the market share when we discounted that, other than we got some of the conventional coffee purchasers to buy the fair trade coffee. Now, if anyone's familiar with the idea of coupon discounts or shelf-based discounts in supermarkets, this sounds a lot like the difference between discounting brands and looking at price changes across commodities. Right? When you think of those mass market brands on the supermarket shelf, it's relatively easy to get someone to change the brand they buy that week by putting a discount on it. Relatively. Not completely, but relatively. But it's really hard to get people to stop drinking coffee by discounting another beverage. Or even when we see large increases in the price of green bean coffee, coffee drinkers still stick with the product overall, right? So relatively unresponsive to differences in price on the commodity, but very responsive for brands. So for these fair trade coffee drinkers, the implication of our experiment, fairly small contained experiment, was that this is not just another brand. It's being treated like a separate commodity for several of these coffee drinkers. At least that's my interpretation. I'd be interested in hearing other interpretations of that as well. There's a lot of other issues around food and beverage. What I think really a key driving factor of why these credence attributes are going to become more rather than less important for coffee, for any other product, is because we're entertaining ourselves in a huge way by thinking about food and beverages. Okay, until March of the Penguins came along, and that's a great documentary, but until that came along, the best-selling documentary, highest-grossing documentary of all time was Super Size Me. People entertaining themselves by watching somebody order the extra-large French fries. Mark Bittman's column, NPR's The Salt, these things are mass-market phenomena, right? People are really putting time and effort into entertaining themselves, not just with food, that's not new, but learning and thinking about food and thinking about how these things are produced. Okay? The numbers that Tracy was mentioning about how many millennials self-identify as being foodies, right? I mean, that's huge. This is a hobby in an increasing way. And so I think these credence attributes, how things are produced, will become more, not less important. Now, we could be cynical about that. And maybe some of you have seen this in your own careers and in your own work, that perhaps some consumers are motivated just by the presence of absence of something good. Like, did I do something good for the planet today? I can check off that box, and the details might not matter. Several years ago, about over a decade ago now, the city of Berkeley proposed and put to a voter referendum an initiative that said every brewed cup of coffee sold in the city limits was going to have to be fair trade, shade-grown, or organic. And that word "or" fascinated me. Personally, I think it was a bit heavy-handed. So did the voters of Berkeley. This was not accepted. But that idea of the moral equivalence, that it just had to be something good. If you think there's a problem with the growers' livelihoods, well, but that's canceled out by if we protect bird habitat, right? So that moral equivalence, I think, is actually there for some consumers. They just want to know, I checked that box. For other folks, the details matter greatly. And any of you have followed the disputes around the differences in what different fair trade certification schemes mean for coffee supply chains. And those have gotten very heated, with at least one well-known company actually detailing their stance in that dispute on the packages of some of their products, right? So for some people, the details are very important. For others, they're ignoring it, or it's perhaps a distraction. So there's perhaps a cynical side, but I still think people are learning more and more about this and care more and more about this. And I think that this idea of the credence nature of the product is an increasingly important one. So again, I'm not a coffee expert. I'm just somebody who likes to think about food and do some experiments with them. I really would welcome the opportunity to chat with any of you tomorrow when we have the salons. We can discuss questions or your viewpoints then. Thank you very much.